Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're really excited to have such a great audience today. I'm looking around. I know some faces, but there's a lot of new ones I don't know. And for you, welcome. Thanks for coming. As you may know, this is part of Vermont Archaeology Month. It's a bunch of events that we're putting on throughout the state, and hopefully this will be one of the best lectures that we have for this month. I'd like to thank some sponsors to start off with. Obviously, the University of Vermont Anthropology Department, number one. The Vermont Archaeology Heritage Center, located in Barrie. The Center for Research on Vermont for helping with the filming and setup. Thank you very much. Regional Educational Television Network. Thank you. Also, Vermont Archaeology Month wouldn't be possible without the support of the Vermont Agency of Transportation, the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development, the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, and the National Life Group. Thank you. So welcome to the first annual James B. Petersen Archaeology Lecture. Hopefully this will be first of many to come. For those of you who didn't know Jim, I'd like to take a moment to introduce him. Jim received his BA in Anthropology and Environmental Studies from UVM in 1979, and a PhD in Anthro from the University of Pittsburgh in 1983. He headed up the Archaeological Research Facility at UMaine Farmington for a number of years before coming back to UVM in 1997 as an associate professor and chair of the Anthro department. He was promoted to professor posthumously. Jim was fascinated by the archaeology of Eastern North America, as well as the Caribbean and Brazilian Amazon. He taught courses in historic archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, archaeology theory, fieldwork in archaeology, hunter-gatherer cultures, native cultures of South America, people and cultures of the Caribbean, native cultures of Vermont, and native cultures of North America. I took a number of these classes with him, and they were some of my favorite of my time at UVM. He was loved and respected by many. Sadly, he was killed in the summer of 2005 while doing research in Brazil, but his passion and legacy will pass on with everyone he touched. When Gio asked me to introduce the lecture series, she asked me to do one quick anecdote, and I thought really hard and long about what I could do. And when I was thinking back to my time here at UVM, I thought, I was thinking about when the first time I met Jim was, and it's exactly 10 years ago this week. I came with my family visiting UVM. We didn't really have an appointment with the Anthro department, but we went up, and Jim was in his office, and he met with us for over an hour and a half. He probably had other work to do, and he probably could have, just given me a quick tour, but he really spent a lot of time. And I was thinking that if he hadn't been there that day, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have come to UVM, and I wouldn't be here in Vermont. So I really owe a lot to him and for taking the time to give me his passion. My story isn't really that unique. A lot of people have similar stories, and I'm sure some of you here do as well. And one of those people is Dr. John Crock, who will be giving his lecture today. He's the director of the UVM Consulting Archaeology Program and associate professor at UVM. And with that, I would like to turn the podium over to John, and I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Brennan. Great introduction. I'd also like to thank Richard Watts and the Center for Research on Vermont and RETN for doing the filming tonight. And Giovanna Peebles, our state archaeologist, who's not here, who's really done a lot to help organize Archaeology Month and started Archaeology Month. I hope you all know that it's Archaeology Month, and we'll continue to celebrate Archaeology Month well beyond the end of the month. For us, for the archaeologists, it's archaeology all the time. But we really look forward to Archaeology Month to share the results of our work. It was appropriate that Brennan Gauthier of the Vermont Agency of Transportation did the introduction. I'll be talking a lot about archaeology that's funded by the Agency of Transportation, and a lot of the results that I'll summarize or try to tonight were generated as a result of regulatory archaeology, which is how most archaeology in the U.S. is done today, not through research grants or maybe some volunteer time, but through regulatory archaeology, that is state and federal laws that require the survey of archaeologically sensitive areas prior to developments like highways, like bridges. And we do a lot of this work, many times not finding anything. There's a lot of negative archaeology, which we think is positive because we are at least refining our predictive models and learning where sites aren't as much as where sites are. So casting this broad net, we often don't come up with very much, but sometimes we do find a significant site, and it makes it all the worthwhile because these sites are all part of a puzzle that we're putting together. It's a work in progress, so also appropriate for the Center for Research on Vermont that sponsors Research in Progress series. This is appropriate because all archaeology is research in progress by definition. I want to start also by thanking in advance and in hindsight all of the archaeologists who've worked with me at the Consulting Archaeology Program. It's through their hard labor, thousands of hours of work, and then I get to come up here and talk about it. Some of them are here tonight, but I want to pay homage to those people and their hard work, as well as other archaeologists who have contributed. Indeed, we're here to also celebrate Jim Petersen, a teacher, a mentor, a friend, the chair of anthropology when I was hired here at UVM. And no better way to celebrate Jim and his life than by doing or talking about archaeology. Jim loved that. The majority of Vermont's archaeological past is, of course, Native American, and I'll be focused on that tonight. Native people have been in what is now Vermont for over 12,000 years. And archaeology is particularly good at, or particularly well suited at dealing with scales of time on this long-term level. Broad changes, human adaptations to the environment, human adaptation to settlement patterns within a specific region like the Champlain Valley. All of these are archaeological within the purview of archaeology. Archaeology can also address shorter term issues, but it has more of a challenge to deal with things that we living people are familiar with, generational changes or annual changes. While archaeology has been getting better at that, it's still a challenge, particularly here in Vermont, where our soils are so acidic that much of material culture doesn't preserve. And so we're left with durable artifacts such as stone tools and pottery to tell us the story of the past, tell us the story of people who were as dynamic and interesting as living people, any living people. I'll talk a bit about both of these scales as much as I can based on some recent research that we've been doing in Vermont, and I hope you can see some of the challenges and also some of the results that we've come up with. 12,500, 13,000 years ago, Paleo-Indians came into Vermont. I know my title said 14th to 16th century. I'm not going to go year by year from 12,500 back. This is just to give you a perspective on that continuity that I'm talking about. Around this time, Lake Champlain, or the Champlain Basin, was filled with the Champlain Sea, a saltwater ocean that extended all the way to the Atlantic. And we believe now that people probably entered the state, or what is now Vermont, via the St. Lawrence River Valley into what's now the Lake Champlain Basin, along with possible routes up major river valleys like the Connecticut and the Hudson Valley. But certainly there would have been a very, very strong connection to the Atlantic, and they may have followed seals and whales into what would have been a very attractive body of water at that time that had maritime resources within it. So people coming in here with probably, and most definitely based on archaeological data, a strong relationship to the east based on possible migration routes that came from the east, along with archaeological evidence that we have of stone tools, stone raw materials that come from locations such as Monsungan Lake in northern Maine. A very glassy raw material, Monsungan chert, is found in many Paleo-Indian sites around New England. And this is one of the earliest connections between the Champlain Valley and areas to the east, along with areas to the west. We certainly also find materials from a broader area based on social interaction between people, as well as direct acquisition of these materials by people who moved around quite a bit. And that was a theme that persisted right through European contact. Native people in the Champlain Valley were relatively mobile for much of prehistory, and seasonally moving around within family bands and sometimes larger aggregations of people. Fast forward to European contact era, and we see the result, if you will, or at least the continuation of this relationship between areas east of Lake Champlain and west of, say, the coast of Maine. The Wabanaki people, and before that, Proto-Abenaki populations related by a language group. They all spoke an Algonquian language, and they were related by trade and exchange and evidence of social interaction. And this becomes more clear when we have the historic records to study how Native people reacted to European contact. Again, with particular emphasis on the back and forth relationships between these areas across New England. One of these examples is during the stress or aftermath of European contact, after Native populations had been decimated by disease, English settlements were encroaching up the Connecticut River, basically forcing Native people from their traditional lands. And one thing that happened was Native people sought refuge at a village called St. Francis, or now Odenak, on the St. Francis River, right near the St. Lawrence River. This was established in 1660, but took more and more people from all over New England. And this might be the result of the close relationship between Abenaki people and the French were well entrenched in the St. Lawrence Valley. But I also believe it had a lot to do with long-term interactions and the knowledge and familiarity of this region that people had. And they knew where to go, and this is one of the places that they went, the St. Lawrence River. And so it was not something new, but something very, very old, that there was a connection between people living on the St. Lawrence River and people living elsewhere in New England, including the Champlain Valley. The actual contact, the first contact with people in the region came when Jacques Cartier came up the St. Lawrence in 1535, and at present-day Montreal recorded a large village, a palisaded village, or a village with a large log fence around it that he called Hochelaga. And Cartier documented this, but didn't do too much to document the peoples. There's not much record of the extent of the populations. Some descriptions, one description was that when people got there, when the French got there, the native people threw bread into their boats, and you might look at this as a traditional welcoming, but you also may look at it as these people already knew what starving white people wanted, and it's better to throw the bread at them before they take it from you. When Samuel Champlain came up the same river in 1609, Hochelaga was gone. The village described by Cartier was no longer there. And this has created an archaeological problem, if you will. What happened to the people living at Hochelaga, living on the St. Lawrence? Where did they go in this period of time? And this this has presented an archaeological question that has been researched and continues to be. This was based on a sort of lost in translation description of a circular village with a palisade, interpreted by artists in Europe, a sort of more regular European urban plan was not probably how Hochelaga was organized. More likely, and this is based on archaeological evidence in Quebec and Ontario, it was based on a series of longhouses that, based on archaeological reconstructions, may have looked something more like the artist's rendition here. This then becomes an archaeological question. And the peoples of Hochelaga and elsewhere in the St. Lawrence River were in the 60s given the name St. Lawrence Iroquoians because there wasn't any historic reference as there were for Five Nation Iroquois going back from historic records into prehistory. So this was a name given to them without really any evidence, if you will, of straight connections with Five Nations Iroquois, but this was, they were certainly related and by geographically related, but it was a broad cultural group that shared settlement patterns, shared material culture, as I'll talk about tonight, that was given this broad name, St. Lawrence Iroquoians, and that's what we are left with as archaeologists when we look at the material culture associated with these people. A map showing the distribution of St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites throughout the St. Lawrence drainage. Some of the larger sites represented, village sites represented by the red dots. The yellow represents more smaller scale evidence in terms of, say, material remains like pottery. And you'll see some of these, and I've tried to update this map a bit. Some of these occur in the Champlain Valley, and that's what I'll talk about tonight, the relationship and the possible presence of these people in what's now Vermont. Here is a closer view of some of the locations where St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites, or at least this material culture, has been found. And again, we're dealing with such a limited evidence as archaeologists. We're very careful about associating directly the presence of pottery with a particular cultural group. It's very, very dangerous, obviously, to say wherever this pottery occurs, that must be where this cultural group existed. But in some cases, it's all we have to go on, so we've got to work with it. A few of the first evidence really came right near the Winooski River Valley in Mallett's Bay, and some jars that are on display at the Fleming Museum. And in case you have never seen them, you should definitely make a point of getting over there to the James Petersen Hall of Native American Hall to see these in person. I'll show you a couple slides, but the real things are much better. These were found back in the 1800s. Whole pots, very, very rare, as I'll show you later on, some sherds, the size of pottery that we find typically is more like quarter size. So finding a whole vessel is extraordinary. And many of these were found very, very early on and fortunately preserved and now preserved in the Fleming's Museum collection. But you can get a sense of this style, the artistic style of this pottery, called globular vessels because of their sort of globular shape, and the decoration that occurs on the collared rim, this what we call circular punctate, those circular impressions, and the incision, very geometric in its form. This is the classic St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery. Well, we have a couple of jars. Does that mean the people are here? It's very, very hard to say. The Bolton jars, also 2 jars found near Bolton Falls in the 1800s as well. Whole vessels also connecting us to the St. Lawrence Iroquoian sphere. A guy named Jim Pendergast was the first to suggest, a Canadian archaeologist, that Vermont actually had a cluster of St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites. In many cases, these villages occurred in clusters representing related family groups and villages. And he believed all along that Vermont had one of these based on observations that he made and another guy Skylar Miller made, of the collections in the Fleming Museum. And here's one such piece that comes from Mallett's Bay. Other sites, as you would expect, focused towards the north, the closest area to the St. Lawrence River, along the Pike River, up in the northeast part of Missisquoi Bay, and then the Richelieu River, the main outlet of Lake Champlain. Obvious corridors between the lake and the St. Lawrence River, as they had been, as I mentioned, since 12,000 years ago. A few other of these sherds from Alberg Center and Lake Carmi. So you see these are popping up. One of the problems is these came from private collections, not from systematic archaeological excavations. You have to invest a lot of time to be able to study a whole site, but we have a lot of these pieces that have locational information from them, but they don't have any other context, which is unfortunate. We'd love to know whether this represents just a lost vessel or a larger settlement. Some of these other larger sites in this area really showing a focus within the Champlain Islands of the St. Lawrence Iroquoian evidence. One of these sites that we had the good fortune and opportunity to work on, the Bohannon site, done as in the context of an Agency of Transportation project, as I mentioned. This one for the reconstruction of the of the Missisquoi Bay Bridge. I got my bridges confused. The Missisquoi Bay Bridge, and we did archaeology in advance of that at the Bohannon site. An extraordinary site, again, that never would have been discovered were it not for the regulatory context that led to the archaeology there. At the Bohannon site, found this St. Lawrence Iroquoian style pottery. This is the corn ear motif. The people, as documented by Cartier and as documented archaeologically, were corn agriculturalists. Corn made its way into what's now Vermont and into southern Quebec around AD 1000 or so, after being domesticated far to the south. It became a staple crop, but there's some debate how reliant people were on corn, whether it really dominated their lives or whether it was just introduced to augment the resources that people had subsisted on for centuries and millennia. Interestingly, the pottery analysis from this site in Alberg, doing what's called neutron activation analysis of samples of the pottery and also samples of raw clay coming from an area near Trois-Rivières in Quebec, shows that this pottery was made with clay from near the St. Lawrence River. So the question then becomes, are there people bringing down this pottery, making it in the St. Lawrence Valley, bringing it with them, or are these pots traded down? Other examples, you can see some of these almost anthropomorphic, if you will, faces represented by these circular punctates and this other incised design. Very classic St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery from the Bohannon site. Also, evidence of clay smoking pipes. Very, very important reflection of native culture, the importance of tobacco, the ceremonial importance of it. Tobacco being very important also for meetings, ceremonies of all kinds. And this is evidence of that here at the Bohannon site. These are also much more related in style to St. Lawrence Iroquoian pipes. You can see the human-like faces in the piece on the upper right, along with a possible corn ear type design, very similar to the pottery. So some of this artistic design transferring in between vessels and pipes. Interestingly, very few stone artifacts coming out of the Bohannon site. And I say that because this is one of the mainstays of archaeology in Vermont, finding remains of stone tool manufacturing, lithic tools and flakes. Most sites are identified as a result of the recovery of those. But the lack of stone tools here is also very much associated with St. Lawrence Iroquoian settlement patterns and lifeways. They were only using stone tools in a limited fashion and making their weaponry and other tools likely out of perishable materials like bone, antler, and so on, and wood. One other thing that we did here, looking sort of as that slide I showed you from the McCune site in Ontario, looking for settlement patterns. Does this site have a representation of longhouses like we might expect of a St. Lawrence Iroquoian site? So we stripped off the plow zone with a backhoe to look for these patterns in the soil, to look for post molds. The posts don't preserve, but the stains in the soil are still represented in many cases. Very carefully cleaning off the surface after the backhoe scraping. We see Kate Kenny there on the right, one of our audience members. I won't point her out because she might throw something. What these circles look like, very faint stains. It really does take a trained eye to locate them in the mix, but you can kind of make out these circular stains that are representative of post holes. Interestingly, the diameter that we got off of these is very, very similar and equivalent to St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites. There was a standard that they followed, if you will, of selecting posts for their structures. We cut out plastic circles to put on top of these in various sizes to try to get a view of these from above, in hopes that it would help us determine whether we had longhouse patterns or not. And so you can see how these laid out, and you can see even from here a bit of a linear pattern here. And of course, we are dealing with a site that's been disturbed by agriculture. In some cases, plowing went deep enough to actually probably remove these shallow post hole stains, and so we may have some gaps. But it's something that we're still working with, and I'll show you a map, and you'll see why it's difficult. This is what these look like after they're cross-sectioned. You can actually see how the post was plunged into the soil, excavated out, and then backfilled. So this is what it looks like after being mapped. A connect the dots exercise. You can find longhouses in here if you try. It doesn't take very much, but also circular structures. So I do believe that we have some patterns, again, following this linear pattern of posts of similar size. We have removed at this level all those that we determined to be rodent burrows and other historic features, which is also one thing that confuses archaeologists. But we believe we have evidence of longhouses here. The amount of remains, though, the amount of trash, the amount of pottery, the amount of stone tools, the amount of food remains, doesn't really speak to a long occupation at this site. So that's one thing that's interesting about it. And the other thing that's interesting, too, you might ask, why didn't you follow out those post molds and figure out where the end of the house was? Well, it was under the existing road or on private property. And so there's high value in regulatory archaeology, but sometimes high frustration when you want to work outside of the project area, but you're not allowed to, because that's not part of the regulatory process. We know that some of the site's still preserved on private property, and it may be possible to do more investigations there in the future. Other things that came out of the site, sort of suggesting the lifeways of the people, subsistence patterns, a wide range from mice to bear in terms of size of animals exploited, various seasons represented, various fishes represented here. Some of the creatures, such as the flying squirrels, may may represent a later fall, a winter occupation even, because these are more likely acquired during their hibernation phase, unless they're being caught in midair. But you can see just the range of species. It wasn't a one-dimensional food pattern by any sense. As well, we have remains of economic plants, various blackberries, elderberries, other weed plants that were consumed by people elsewhere and at this site. One of the more interesting, I'd say, is also the presence of corn, the presence of maize, not only in its kernel form, but also in other parts of the corn plant, suggesting that it was grown very close by. So that's another neat thing about this site, as well as some beech nut, butternut, also speaking to a fall occupation potentially at this particular site. Well, one of the sort of end result of archaeology and more expensive endeavors is to radiocarbon date sites. And this is how we might get at that tighter time scale. We are always eager to find ways to really narrow the time period of an occupation. And in this case, using AMS dates, a form of radiocarbon dating that gives you a very, very tight error range, but they cost about $600 each. So you really want to make sure you're dating something that is cultural, that you're not dating a root burn or last year's 4th of July barbecue. You want to, in this case, we're dating material that came out of washing of soil that came out of these buried features, hearth features, for example, and in this case also testing economic plants like maize, actually taking a kernel of maize we know was grown by people, we know was prehistoric, and getting a date on those. And so these are the dates that I'm showing you, but they have themselves a pretty wide error range, even at this 95% confidence level, which is what I'm showing you here. But if you look at particularly the maize, which is a little bit more accurate because of its lifespan, is very short compared to an oak tree, for example, you can see the date of occupation somewhere in here just shy of 1500 or 1450 to 1500. That is if it's a single occupation. People may have returned to this site more than once within this 200-year period, but clearly the span of occupation was within between 14 and 1600. So whether or not this site represents refugees out of the St. Lawrence Valley, maybe those people from Hochelaga coming down sometime after 1535, it's possible, but it appears that the site was occupied a little bit before that, perhaps indicating the presence of St. Lawrence Iroquoians in the Champlain Valley prior to that time. One of the things we did to investigate another hallmark of these St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites was to excavate out towards the lake in an effort to find a palisade. If indeed this was a palisaded village, we might find evidence of that, particularly closer to the lake shore where you'd want to have your defenses up. And no evidence was found of this. So that, indicates to me that this population was there not in a defensive posture, but perhaps with among communities that the people living there were friendly with. Other sites nearby, one inelegantly called GI 33, known also from Alberg, same kind of pottery found there. Also produced a radiocarbon date right around that same period of time, right in the 1450 range. Sites found by archaeologist Tom Jameson, also in the Alberg area, one called the Summit Site, similar design pottery. Southview and Ransom Bay also producing St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery, all not too far away from the Bohannon site within this general region. And looking at these, you can see again how they cluster and logically so in the northern part of the lake, the closest part of the Champlain Valley to the St. Lawrence River. One idea is that these folks are occupying a territory in between land that was related to or populated by the Iroquois, the Mohawk in particular, on the west side of the lake, the New York side, and the eastern side populated by Proto-Abnaki or Abnaki people. Perhaps these St. Lawrence Iroquoians were occupying a neutral space in between these areas, in the middle of what is called the Lake Between in Abnaki, Batabagoc. Well, this idea is a little bit blown up by some other finds in the southern part of the valley. It's not only restricted to the northern part of the basin. We have, again, from collections, from sites right along the Arda Creek in Vergennes, and then along the Lemon Fair down in Cornwall, very similar. Here's from the Weeks School site on the Arda Creek, classic St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery. And also from the Whipple site, another transportation project yielding St. Lawrence Iroquoian evidence down on the Lemon Fair River. Smaller but obvious, the sherds represented here. And also up in St. Albans, another collection recently documented showing that this pottery is here, showing that this was a broadly distributed ceramic style that may represent the presence of a population or certainly trade and interaction with people in the St. Lawrence River. Looking at these in context, we have to think about how these materials moved around, what types of conditions would have produced them, and look more broadly too. Some of this pottery has also turned up in New Hampshire and Maine, further showing this broad connection between the St. Lawrence River and broader parts of the Northeast. Here's a reconstructed pot from the Sandy River in Maine, a tributary of the Kennebec. Pottery, you can see that same cornier motif on this pottery from the Engels site, Coos area of New Hampshire. Interestingly, this pottery too was made with clay that some came from the northern areas up around the St. Lawrence River. Other pottery, also of the same style, was made with local clay. So interesting things going on there. And just to show you the comparison, again, the cornier motif from Bohannon, very similar to classic material from the St. Lawrence River. So these explanations, just in simple terms, could be, again, resident populations, could be trade, but we also see in evidence, particularly in Maine, of copying of this pottery, of this style, what are called homologies. These copies, which are knockoffs, if you will, poorer representations of the original, but made in that same style. And one of the questions is, okay, well, if this is St. Lawrence Iroquoian pottery, what was Proto-Abnaki pottery? What was the Algonquian style? And one of the issues that we have with this period, and interestingly, Jim Petersen was the expert on ceramics in the Northeast and created a typology of ceramic styles that is broken down into what we call very narrow periods in archaeology, about 300 years. And there are some similarities between the two in terms of decorative techniques, but there are also some differences. But one of the challenges that we have, particularly for this late prehistoric period, for the eve of contact, if you will, many of those sites, many of those villages don't exist anymore because they were in the very same places of our modern villages of Winooski, of Swanton, of Vergennes, these prime locations on major rivers that were overbuilt or developed by Europeans. And so many of these locations we can never see, but we're still hopeful, of course, that some will come up. One site that does fit this same time period. 619, right at the mouth of the Huntington River, near where the Huntington enters the Winooski in Richmond, Vermont. Another transportation project done by the Consulting Archaeology Program now years ago, before my time, which is now going on 13 years here. This project yielded a late woodland period site of about 14 to 1600. One of the great things about this site was it was sealed beneath flood deposits. As we all know, Vermont has a history of flooding in major river valleys. We know more about that lately than we have in 100 years. What it does for archaeology is it preserves sites and seals off cultural components that can then be radiocarbon dated and studied later on. This site yielded a globular ceramic vessel of the late woodland style, but you can also see some of the similarities between this one and the St. Lawrence Iroquois Colchester jar, the collared vessel, the globular shape, and also the linear incision. And so some similarities but differences as well between the pottery styles. And I believe we're sorting it out, and it's not to say that people didn't use both. As we know, based on our own cupboards, there's sometimes a mix of styles represented. Another site I want to talk about that was also very exciting and sort of one of these that you're sort of hoping comes around to address this period of time between about 1300 and 1600 was a site that we had the opportunity to work on right near the Burlington Airport. And this was as a result of the reconfiguration of a road behind the airport, National Guard Road. This work was just completed a couple of years ago, and we just finished the report very recently. Here's where the site was. This is a more recent Google Earth image showing what the Air Guard has done, build this new road basically to move the road away from the airport for obvious reasons. And this site, there's a new security station there. If any of you go down there, it's now the most well-protected archaeological site in the state of Vermont. And I'll show you some early weaponry as well from the Native era. Here's a close-up of where the site is and was. A lot of effort was made, and this happens a lot in archaeology, to re-engineer the roadway to avoid the archaeological site, to preserve it. So sections of this site are buried, sections were disturbed, but more of the site also still exists to be studied in the future, potentially when archaeologists are smarter and have better technology. Here's just an overlay of our block excavations at the site that we did, focused on earlier phases of work where the densest material was and also where the impacts were going to be. But you can see here, we also ran into the same challenge. We're up against an existing roadway, so we couldn't expand our work that way. But we had some incredible results nonetheless. And here's some of the CAP archaeologists I referenced hard at work at the site. Screening material coming out of this site, relatively shallow, only about 18 to 24 inches in terms of its depth. A larger block near completion, and you can see the cultural features lining up in the wall there. All of that dark soil is a result of human activity, compost, if you will, trash deposits, and living floors of the native people who lived there. We also had some really excellent preservation of storage features. This is if you can see it in here, a classic bell-shaped storage pit. And you can see it's actually been capped off by fill. The road is just beyond here, capped off by road fill, and then a small plow zone disturbed the top of it, but a lot of it is still preserved. And out of these storage pits came in some incredible botanical results as well. Again, we've got maize from this site. We also have nutshell. And thinking about this, archaeologists had, historically, whenever you find a butternut or an acorn, you assumed it was a fall occupation. Well, we all can see the limitations of that, given that these nut meats are probably the easiest and most storable foods. And so looking also at the corn evidence here and some of the other stone tool evidence, it's highly likely that this was a fall wintering camp where people were set up for a longer period of time. And this kinds of flies a little bit in the face of traditional models which had Abenaki, proto-Abenaki people in the river valleys in the summer, moving into the interior in the winter to hunt, dispersing into small family band groups. This would suggest that around this period of time, and this site dates to really close to 1300, we had some stable villages, or at least for a portion of the year, people living in a larger community, and also very close to the major channel of the river. Here's some other post-hull evidence. So we've got structural evidence. People have invested time in this site to build structures, living there for a period. And looking at the plan view, you can see our analysis and interpretation of the function of some of these features that we found: storage pits, fire hearths, and then that darker brown, just basically a living floor enhanced by human activity. All of these triangles represent projectile points, and so this is an incredible number of triangular projectile points or arrowheads that were found at this site. Also speaking to the function of it as a camp, potentially a wintering camp. We have evidence of stone tool manufacture here, extensive evidence of that. And some of these points are interesting that more than half of them, I'd say, are without the tip. You can see these are broken tips. And what this shows us is that people were going out hunting, coming back to the camp, untying the arrowhead, keeping the shaft and fletching, because that was the hardest part, discarding the broken tip, rehafting a new one, and reusing the arrow shaft in that way. And so we've got a lot of evidence of this long-term sort of hunting and then returning to the site that's going on there. Pottery from the site. This is what pottery in Vermont looks more like. I showed you some whole vessels, but now I'll show you what we deal with more on a daily basis. Still, some of this having some evidence of decoration that allows us to suggest that it's attributable to the late woodland period, which we later confirmed with the radiocarbon dates. Lithic debitage, a fancy word for chipping or flakes from the manufacture of stone tools, showing you a density distribution of these, really clustering in one part of the site near the residence, perhaps right outside the residence as a refuse area. This is material that you'd want to collect and dispose of, sharp flakes, for example, deposited in this portion of the site, matching the distribution of some of the other stone tools I showed you. One of the more interesting things about this site, I'd say one of the most exciting things, is looking over the area, which is about 4 acres, and samples taken from each corner of the site, these different features, and using, again, economic species that were collected as foodstuffs by people, either maize, and in one case we did date some wood charcoal, the hop hornbeam, but we dated butternut shell, maize, and these dates all came back very, very close to one another with this high confidence interval, 95% confidence. We believe the site was occupied right around 1315, and maybe the fall or winter of 1315. BTV, the airport at 1315, and very, very exciting, again, to address this sort of short term in archaeology with what we have here in Vermont. It's really exciting for us, and also to link up different parts of the site. Without these dates, you could suggest that one part of the site was occupied 1 year, and then 100 years later, people came to another part of the site. But this shows us that the whole site was occupied around the same time, probably as a larger scale village. No evidence was found of a palisade, but we do again have this strong evidence of a larger group living together through this period where previously we might have assumed that they were dispersed in this part of the year. So lastly, I'll just let you reflect a bit on this slide showing all of the known archaeological sites in Vermont. And I haven't put the Vermont border on there because I think the sites do a pretty good job. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 sites are known, and a site could get a designation because one artifact was found in it. I showed you some of those. And so of all these thousands of sites, there are only a handful that give us this information about settlement and really allow us to reflect on time, whether it be the long term or the shorter term that we're really interested in terms of human interaction. But with continued archaeology, there's always a chance with any project that gets done in this regulatory context that another site is going to be found that contributes to this understanding, whether it be the understanding of the St. Lawrence Iroquoian dynamics with resident Abenaki or Proto-Abenaki populations, or other issues related to the long history of Native Americans in Vermont. It's an exciting time to be doing archaeology here in Vermont, and a beautiful time of year to be doing archaeology as well. Thank you all for coming tonight. I would entertain any and all questions that you have. We have plenty of time for that. Thank you. Yes, right up.
If I'm on private property, my own property, and I decide to dig a swimming pool, and I come across some fascinating arrowheads and pieces of pottery, first of all, do I have any legal obligation to do anything about it? And second of all, is it a good idea, or am I going to have your little troops swarming all over my
Well, it's on private property in a project that's outside, outside the regulatory process. People can do whatever they want, and that's a Vermont tradition, for sure. And but I will say also that we are so busy, working in advance of road projects or larger housing developments that there's almost no time for people to come swarm to your property. But if you did find something, we would welcome the information, and all it would be photographing artifacts, say, or reporting them to the state. It wouldn't limit you or inhibit your own desire to develop your property at all. But it's information, and we really welcome that, whether it be from artifact collectors, private landowners. It all helps,
Thank you.
Yes.
So the St. Lawrence Iroquois, they weren't really Iroquois?
Great question. They were called Iroquoian because of Cartier recorded some Iroquoian words. I'm told it was in the range of a couple dozen. So the association is based on language, but also the broad association with this archaeological culture. They were not affiliated with the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy. And in fact, one explanation for where they went or why they left the St. Lawrence Valley was pressure from Iroquoian groups, the Five Nations Iroquois, particularly the Mohawk. And that would be also why they may have had palisaded villages, because this was a threat at and around the time of Cartier and before. So the association in name is in name only, and also the geographic location of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians relative to the Five Nations Iroquois, and of course the modern communities of Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people in that area. I think it's confusing, and I agree, and it has created some unnecessary controversy, if you will, or misinformation, and it's really hard to undo the work of archaeologists who worked 60 years ago and published a lot on this. And they're more comfortable in the St. Lawrence Valley and in Quebec with this designation because it doesn't bring up the same modern sort of political confusion that might exist. But it just goes to show how difficult it is for us to project back modern ethnic and cultural identities back into the past when in the past, archaeologically, we don't have the same wealth of information to deal with. Yeah, sure.
Have you ever gotten calls where someone asks you to come and look at something they maybe have found?
Yes, and in fact, people come in to our offices regularly asking if what they've found is an artifact, and we're happy to do that. And happy to look at it, as are the folks at the Division for Historic Preservation. They field a lot of inquiries by landowners who find things and wonder if it's an artifact or not, and that's part of it. I mean, some of these pieces it's really hard to tell without the training. Yes, Richard.
John, one question, but also I'd be remiss. Giovanna Peebles asked, because of Archaeology Month, she had a survey, and that was circulated. If people have a minute, it's the blue sheet, I think, and you can give some feedback on Archaeology Month. Is there ever an issue when you're working like at the Air Guard, in places that are kind of top secret or sensitive? Is that?
I think so. Only in the sense of working, say, maybe in a private development context, or sometimes in the regulatory process, you want to do the work in advance. You'd love to share it, but it's really part of the process. And and at times it takes us years to get to a point where we can talk, intelligently about what we found sometimes. And so that's part of it too. We'd love to do a lot more of inviting people out to excavations to show people. And that Air Guard site was one of those where we did have a lot of public interest. It was outside of the main security zone at the airport, so the public could come there. There's an active archaeological excavation going on in Swanton, many of you may know about, on Route 78. Great opportunity when they're working there to visit an archaeological site and see archaeologists working, and very convenient too, very accessible. It's right off of the road. But that's often a challenge too, not just the security issues or information control, but accessibility. Sometimes where we're working is inaccessible to us, let alone a school bus of school children. Yes, in the back.
Of these several thousand sites in Vermont, are most of these from what you were calling regulatory archaeology?
I would say probably not. Most of them are from private collectors who have shared their information. Some of those have been followed up with professional or systematic work, but most of those sites, I think it's probably getting to be almost 50-50 now, but originally that's where the wealth of information came from landowners and private collectors. Yes, Dee.
John, just to clarify what we were talking about earlier about the 7 Days article about this possibly being Iroquoian land, I'd like to kind of nip that in the bud because it's not. It's Abenaki, and it's been used by many people, and especially during the wars. And years ago in the 1600s, the Abenaki took many Iroquoian prisoners and worked with them and took them as prisoners during that period of time. So I think that's how a lot of their influence came here, because I'm sure they traveled with pots and shirts and their weapons. So it's definitely Abenaki land here, shared by other people, Mohawks and Iroquoian.
Absolutely. I think it's, the evidence really shows this long-term interaction. I hope you got a sense of that it goes way, way back in deep time. And, some of these materials moved around with people, whether it be marriage partners or trade relationships. And the evidence, I think, at the Bohannon site in Alberg really does show a settlement that was not in a defensive position necessarily. It was, maybe it was a refugee population, but they were certainly here among allies, if you will, or at least friendly folks. And again, this extends out to the broader New England region too, with the relationship between people in the St. Lawrence area and with other Abenaki groups. Yes.
You spoke about the difficulty of organic materials lasting in the Vermont soil. And last night at Vergennes, there was an archaeologist from William and Mary Beaupré who has done excavation on Fort St. Jean on the Richelieu. And he found an astounding piece of birch bark, about 1.5 feet square, incredible detail on it. About half of it was cut. It had been laced with cedar. It showed the punches for the lacing were done with a tool. There were residual pitch sealing it and incision marks on it. And it was just so astounding. This came from 6 feet deep, right by the river. Half of the fort had been washed away by the river. Has anything like that ever been found in Vermont? And why not, if not?
Well, it takes some, in some cases it's a factor of time. And so the more recent the site, the more likely, perishables are likely to preserve. And also its conditions. Some of the best conditions are in those riverbank settings that are well-drained, sandy soils, where you don't have as much water having an effect on the preservation of materials. And also, some of the best preservation in Vermont that's known either from a wet context or a context in one case where materials were buried in association with copper. And native copper, the copper salts actually negate the decomposition process. So in this case, a site that was 2,500 years old had well-preserved hide and textile artifacts. So those are very, very rare cases, but it gets more and more likely as you get closer to the present to have this preservation. We have some dugout canoes from Vermont that have been found, say in Shelburne Pond, that were preserved because they're in this anaerobic environment underwater and they're not subject to that decomposition process. Yes, Duncan.
John, I noticed in the literature from time to time you see the term proto-Abenaki. I'm wondering, can you explain to us how you yourself explain and define what is a proto-Abenaki?
That's a great question. We find ourselves archaeologists getting a little squeamish at projecting back modern ethnic identities back into time. And so that would be the usage, when we're talking about 2-3 generations, 100 years, a continuous occupation, it's easier to conceive of. But that's just because we can't, when we dig up stone tools and pottery, they weren't signed by people, right? Or stamped, this was made by Abenaki. We can assume that. We can assume that these are the ancestors of the modern Abenaki. And so to take care of that, it's sort of the use of the proto-Abenaki term suggests that historic connection, but it tells you that it sort of spans this division between the historic and the prehistoric.
It's like using the term Algonquian instead of proto-Abenaki.
Well, Algonquian, and that's a language group too, so it's a little bit difficult too to talk about language groups in prehistory because we can't very well dig up language. So that's also it's a difficult thing that, as you can see with the St. Lawrence Iroquoian terminology, we're dancing around a lot of these issues, trying to be true to the evidence. Is that? Yes, Deborah.
John, I was intrigued by the observation that there's a small percentage of lithics in these unfortunately named St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites. Is that something that you see throughout the area, farther to the north at all the St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites?
Yep, and that's one thing we tried to do, again, trying to get away from pottery as our only line of evidence, trying to line up other other similar features, whether it's settlement patterns, the longhouse patterns, the palisaded villages, or the settlement locations, or in this case, the lack of use of stone tools, is consistent with some of those sites up in Quebec and Ontario. Yeah.
How have native populations reacted to these archaeological digs, and have they ever asked you for any artifacts like to be returned to them?
We've worked, I'd say, fairly closely with Abenaki people and Abenaki scholars, and have had debates over this. When the site in Alberg was first discovered, one of my first, I'd say, first acts was to share the results with Native people and show them how similar this pottery was. It didn't shake their confidence in sovereignty at all. It helped open up a dialogue, and I've learned a lot, by talking to Abenaki scholars about this issue, opening up these ideas, and also being very sensitive to the modern political nature of archaeology. Sometimes we think that archaeology is all about the past, but it can be used in the present and in a negative way. Fortunately, the Abenaki in Vermont have state recognition, and something like this couldn't be used as some tool by those who opposed recognition anymore. And that was a big hurdle. In terms of repatriation of artifacts, there hasn't been any discussion of that, because artifacts, if found, are private property. If found on private property, are the property of the landowner in Vermont. The exception would be anything related to human burials, burial grounds, ceremonial objects. There's a protocol of notification of Abenaki elders and leadership to perform ceremonies and rebury remains. They're never to be excavated unless they're really endangered, and that's a negotiation done between the state historic preservation and the Abenaki and archaeologists. So I think there's a pretty good dialogue. It's gotten a lot better, I would say, since I've been here in Vermont. It could certainly be better. We could do more, and I'd love to participate in that, moving forward for sure. Yeah.
Have you personally ever excavated the remains of an ancient civilization, and so what areas have you gone to, like out of Vermont and also in Vermont?
Out of Vermont, I actually did my PhD research in the Caribbean, and so I worked there. I've taken a field school from UVM to the Caribbean, and that's another research area that's very different, and a research area that I was introduced to by Jim Petersen, who the lecture is named after. So he did a lot to expose students not only to local Vermont archaeology, but archaeology elsewhere. He was a guy who was a master of 3 different archaeological regions, the Amazon, the Caribbean, and the Northeast, something that is just unheard of really in the modern era of archaeology, where there's a lot to read, a lot to know, but Jim was one who had the capacity to do that, and we're still trying to get to that level. I don't know that we ever will, but it's something to aspire to. Yes.
Question about predictive models with all these, the data points that are available. How are there models, and how can they be applied? How accurate can they be? At what scale?
We have done, again, in conjunction with the Agency of Transportation and Historic Preservation, have done a predictive model for native prehistoric pre-contact sites in Vermont. It's based on habitability factors, so factors such as level terrain, well-drained soils, proximity to water, confluences of streams and lakes, confluences of rivers and the lake. What it shows you is it's pretty accurate, but what it shows you is it doesn't take but 1 or 2 factors to really drive settlement. So you can't suggest that because an area has 6 or 7 different habitability factors, it would be more likely to contain a significant site, because in some cases all it is level terrain. And if you look at the association with water, because Vermont's such a wet state, it creates a pretty broad model of sensitivity. We were hopeful we'd be able to use it in a regulatory process to eliminate some areas from concern, but what it showed us was a lot of Vermont is sensitive, mainly because a lot of Vermont is proximate to water bodies and water courses, wetlands. All of these were real attractive areas for native habitation, or at least extractive use for some purpose, and are likely to contain sites. So it's something that can be refined. I think what would be really helpful would be to get, and we're approaching this, higher resolution topography data. We have that for some parts of Vermont, this LiDAR data, which will give you a tighter contour, so we can really locate these sort of high probability site areas that we can't see so well now, because some of them are only as big as, say, this table or this side of the room, but you could with better topographic modeling.
Are any of the artifacts or the evidence, has that been fed into the model, or is that not?
A little bit, particularly with respect to those earlier sites. We can look at elevation relative to the Champlain Sea boundary, where we can approximate that based on geologic evidence, and we can highlight those areas that are most likely to contain sites that would have been made by people who were around the lake shore, around the seashore. For example, right here, the UVM green would have been beachfront property at that time, and so this contour would have been where people would have been at that period. So that's one way, to look at those things, or look at areas that would have been wet, sort of at the time of recession of the Champlain Sea, that might have attracted people as wetlands before they dried up. And based on soils, you can sort of target those. So we've done a little bit of that, but it's harder, because through time, people like the same places, whether they're native people or Europeans. And we found this working at the Champlain Bridge down in West Addison. 9,000 years of human history, every cultural ethnic group that ever was present in Vermont. First 9,000 years of native people, but then French, English, colonial period people, all wanted to be there, and all were there, and so it's all piled up on itself. Yes?
Can you give me an idea of how many groups there are that do this type of research, and do they share their findings?
Yes, I think that's a great question. There are a few. We're the only academic organization in Vermont working. There are a few private groups that work in Vermont, one based in Maine, another has an office in Putney, another bigger office in St. Louis, a larger group that works all over the country. And it's definitely part of the professional etiquette to share information, to share reports that are all ultimately filed with the state, as well as local libraries. And then it's our goal, too, to publish the information in peer-reviewed journals. And I'd say that's where we've fallen behind the most, because as we work so quickly to do the archaeology, produce a technical report, there's not a whole lot of time to synthesize the information and get it out there that in a sort of a journal form, a scientific journal form that's shared more broadly. But those working in the near region are always kind of trying to keep up to date on the latest kind of results from other projects, and those are shared.
A developer with a large parcel of land with knowledge, or there's community knowledge that there might have been something going on in a certain area or on that parcel, and for development purposes, a report ends up in a planning and zoning office by a group. Is that more than likely a group out of UVM, and would I guess would that knowledge be dispersed? Or
it's possible, and there are also, most of the regulatory process is very public, and so those reports get filed as part of the public record. But there are cases where it might be a speculative development, and and sort of as Richard alluded to, there's a sensitivity around the information until such time as the developer or the one actually funding the archaeology, is comfortable going forward with the permit process, and that's often done. And sometimes those reports are kind of kept if it doesn't ultimately get out into the public sphere.
Have you found a decline in the or correlation between the number of sites that you see and the arrival of European diseases in the area?
That's it's really hard. And one of the things is we can count up the number of sites, but then you see how hard it is for me to say exactly how old one is versus another. So when we look at population estimates, they become very, very hard. So you could see 100 sites that represent 100 years or 100 sites that represent 1 year. And so it's hard to say, if you assign so many people to one site and so many people to another site, you have X population, and does that go down? And because of the effects of disease are so quick, it's sort of hard to see that. And what we haven't found, to my knowledge, evidence of large-scale burial sites per se that reflect this sort of advent of disease and the decimation of populations. But we certainly have the historic record of the dispersal and the dramatic effects that disease, as well as encroachment on settlement and lands had, and that may be why we have so few of these late prehistoric sites or contact period sites, is because people were forced to aggregate and with allies, and maybe into these defensible places that are now our modern towns and villages. But population estimates in archaeology are really problematic. It's tough. Any other questions? Oh, one more question. Sure.
I was surprised that you were able to determine the species of the particular tree, like pitch pine, growing on the airport site. That might be interesting to try to reconstruct some of the ecological conditions at the time, species that were present.
Yes, and that's I'm hopeful that some of this data, and I just to be clear, I can't do that work. There's a paleoethnobotanist that we work with in Maine, Nancy Seidel, who I picture in a room full of samples in a microscope. We send her samples, and she does the analysis for us. But some of this stuff, exactly, that's one of the things we like to create. And it's interesting that we had pitch pine in sort of the wood charcoal, probably used as a fuel, which may not have been a preferable fuel unless you're camping in a pitch pine forest. And it's a logical place for a longer term habitation because of the well-drained soils that promote that kind of tree life. So it's really interesting, and there's a lot of this information out there for anybody who is interested in it, to try to use it in conjunction with, say, pollen cores and other paleo-environmental data to reconstruct environments in areas that have been really transformed.
Would that be available in data specific to the site? So, for example, if it was on public record, would you be able to drill down to that layer?
Yep. And there are some more synthetic publications, books that deal specifically with paleobotanical evidence, and some of that data is in there. It's very, very site specific, just like a pollen core is, but it can be really helpful. If you're interested in a particular area, I can see if there's anything available. Yeah. One more question.
Does UVM do any of the testing on the soil? Do you have a lab that you look at any of that?
We haven't looked in terms of soil chemistry and things like that. No, but we do sometimes use say a column sample from an excavation to look at rates of deposition and a grain size analysis, basically looking at particularly for those floodplain sites where we're trying to date flood deposits, as well as figure out the geoarchaeology, if you will, of a particular area. Again, it's a little bit more specialized, and undoubtedly there are people on campus, and I've been here 13 years, but I still run into people who I want to collaborate with on campus, and that's the nature of it, both in terms of geology and soil science. But there are more that we could do.
Follow up to this. How long does it take for you to get your soil, the data from your soil samples back?
It could take probably, you can get about 30 days or something like that if you sent it out. It depends. In the past we've done simple things like phosphate fractionation, which can tell you sort of the intensity of occupation in a particular area. It can show you sort of the sort of trash area versus the living area versus a clean space within a site. But it's problematic in Vermont because phosphates, of course, are also indicative of fertilization of agricultural fields. So that can muddy the waters a little bit. Sure.
So do you have like a team of people that goes out to these locations, and who's on your team?
Yes, we have a big team, and we have former students, some current students who now have gone back to school. They were working with us in the summer, but some working in the laboratory on independent study projects, for example. But we have a number of full-time and temporary employees that range in experience and age and education. We have a highly educated crew at this point with PhDs and masters level archaeologists working alongside recent graduates and current students.
Do you ever feel like you actually finish working through a site?
No. In fact, there are many that I hope to, and I have to, that I'm professionally obligated to finish. But that's the real sort of cloud is really just getting through and at least reporting things in such a way that other people can use them in the future. That's kind of the idea behind the regulatory archaeology, is that we're collecting data that can be used at a future time or now, but because these sites are non-renewable and you can't grow another one, and archaeology is destructive, we need to do as best as we can to record it and record it in such a way that it's usable in the future. And that's the challenge. As much as I'd like, any one of these sites could be a PhD thesis, could be a book, but we are constantly kind of moving between projects and just doing what we can to document them. So it's a frustration, as you can see from my explanation. Yes, one more question.
What is the process for a undergraduate to work with your crew of PhD professors and research archaeologists and yourself?
Come talk to me. We talk to students all the time and invite students to participate as volunteers, both in the field and the lab. Another great way to get involved is to do a field school in archaeology. That'll give you the basic training that you could work here at UVM, or you could go out west and do archaeology. It's really it's an intensive course that gives you the skills that allows you to actually be employed to do archaeology, not just do archaeology because you think it's a great thing to do, which we all do, but fortunately we do get paid. Okay. Oh, sure. One more question.
Thanks. You mentioned that a section of the airport site you decided not to do anything with, but to wait for development in archaeology. What would be a tipping point for that kind of decision?
Well, in that case, it wasn't our decision. It was the Air National Guard's decision to reorient their roadway to preserve the site, because at this point, the more we can preserve, the better, because there's so many sites that are threatened, and I would say it's a specific research question, about that particular period of time that it would really have to be something of a major interest and level of funding to go into a site that's protected. As I said, the best protected site in Vermont. There's so many others that are endangered that if we have the time and resources, we should probably spend them there to recover that information that's endangered, rather than going into an area that's protected as a result of a conservation easement or protected as a result of a development that's already put some of the site in green space or something like that. So there's plenty other sites to work with, I guess, is what I'm saying. Thank you. Well, thank you all again for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.